Welcome to the Adventures in Precision podcast. We've got Laurel Aikenhead. How are you this morning?
I'm good. How about you guys?
Awesome. Keith Baker, good to see you as always.
It's a great morning to see you guys.
And I am Andy Slade, and we're happy to have you here with us. We wanted to get together again this morning and talk about things that help you get better as a competitor and talking about our prep going into a big event. So we are precision rifle competitors. We are going to be talking about how we get ready for one of those events, but it could apply to anything. It's more about the process that we use, and it's about how we are able to process in place so that we can perform at a really high level. And we all have a little bit different way of doing things. Let's say we've got a match coming up 3 months out.
All right. So how I decide to, or what match I'm going to shoot is honestly by Googling the match and then seeing what the landscape looks like around it and then see if it's going to be cool or not. That's how I bring my mom along with me a lot of times. So we look for the cool ones that have pretty landscapes or just fun matches that I've gone to before that I'm like, oh, I really like that. Those are the matches I usually go to. So I like to hit some of the out west ones, but do along the East Coast. 3, 4, I'd say I'm practicing pretty consistently. I work out a lot for that. Once it gets to probably like 2, 3 weeks before, probably 2, I start doing some load development, making sure my load is good for that match, double checking everything. And then the week before, I'm practicing pretty heavily and getting everything packed and double going or triple going through my checklists that I've already gone through a million other times.
Keith, how do you decide what matches you're going to?
So for me, I drive the MDT van across the country, right? That's part of my job. First, I have to find which ones I can drive to. So I try and look in a 16-hour window and what's a drivable mat, and I try to check those off the box. From that point, then I look across the country and it's like, wow, what match directors are just simply amazing, put a lot of work back into the game, put it into the sport, right? Put effort into their match. Don't set the same match up every year. Something that's going to push some limits. So I try and target those particular ones. Or if there's a sponsor who puts a lot back into the PRS, I try and support their matches to make sure that, we're helping them out. And then if I can find like an amazing venue, like Utah Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Washington, something that's just got either really big wind or really cool terrain, that's something I want to try and hit because, that's just my passion. My passion's hunting and being in the outdoors and not sitting on a golf course. I try and shoot everything I can drive to because that helps support the company that supports me. The other ones, I just try and find either match directors that put an insane amount of effort in, or I try and find venues that should be absolutely breathtaking or have some cool features that'll up my game, like, shooting against 20-degree down angle at 1,200 yards with wind blowing in off of a lake where you just can't judge that wind completely and you have to find a way to do that. Like, oh, wow, the sagebrush doesn't move here, so how else can I break down and solve the puzzle and make myself a better competitor? Like, those are my favorite matches. And then I try and look for great people. Like, that's the number one reason I do this, right?
Yeah. So there's a few things that I'm hearing between both of you. There's the terrain and like going to places that are interesting. And there's some reasons that those places are interesting. There's just simply it's fun to see like the landscape and the terrain, but also for your personal development, going to places that are new and that are hard to judge. So like if you're not into shooting, one of the things that you'll see is that vegetation in a certain part of the country will react to a 10-mile-an-hour wind differently in another part of the country. So Keith mentioned the sagebrush. Like what we do is go to these different places just to see how we can read that wind and read the terrain and try to apply what we're learning. Another thing I heard you guys say was like, and I think is really important, is trying to support the good matches. Industry, we're trying to make sure that we kind of vote with our pocketbook, so to speak. So we're going to the matches that are put on well, that are executed and ran well, going to places that score fairly and put on a good match. So I like all of that. I think that's really good stuff. I know all of us kind of seek out the AG Cup matches and the qualifiers just because we want to shoot with really good competitors and learn from those competitors. So everybody's always talking about training and education, but if you're not mixing it up with the best out there, like, you're missing out on an opportunity for free education. And then the next thing, let's talk about squatting a little bit. So Laurel, can you talk to us about what is squatting, because people may not be completely familiar if they're just on the fence of going to a match, or maybe they're in a different industry. What is squatting, and how do you go through that process? What does that look like?
So squatting opens up, probably, it depends. It opens up various times before the match, but you get roughly like 12 slots to join in, and it's a race to get into your squad that you want to be in. And that's over the phone. And then once you get there, you travel throughout the match with your little squad, so your little group of people. So you shoot each stage with those same 12 people, and you rotate who goes first. Before I squad, I usually check to see who's coming, if any of my friends are. And then if they aren't, I try to squad with some people that I don't know, see if I can learn anything. You always learn stuff, but see if you can learn anything new from other people. And then I usually try to squad with Andy or Keith or Drew or some of my friends.
All right, Keith, do you have a strategy for squatting?
Yeah, I mean, I don't squad tactically to be a better shooter. I squad first for the energy. I want to have a positive energy of individuals around me, like people that want to compete, professional mindset. They're there to have a good time. And that's key. Like, the people are key for me. So I want to be around people with a good attitude, first of all, because I'm there to work on myself. It's easier for me to do that if I'm not distracted. I try and find a couple friends that I know that have a positive energy, which, I have a list of about 20, and, I consider at least 2 of them friends. They're not going to be there. I typically put my name first on an empty squad, and I let it fill with people that, however it rings out. Like, that's, if I know you or Drew or Andy or somebody's going to be there, dude, I just say, hey, let's jump in a squad. And I try and have us jump in, let's say a squad that's completely empty, right? We put our 3 names down, and then we step aside and just let all the marbles fall where they are. And then I get to meet a lot of new people that way. So I've got a cluster of good people that I know for sure. We can talk about what happened at the end of every day, and we can sit at the campfire and have all the, oh man, do you remember what happened here? And I can, give Laurel a hard time if she did something right or did something wrong. And same with you, Andy. And we can discuss that later. And I know that those people will criticize the mistakes and or the positive things that I did during that match, which makes me a better shooter. Like you said earlier, Andy, I think it's really important that you squad with the best shooters that you can, because the bottom line is you are a product of your competition.
Right. So in these squads, you're going to have all different levels of shooters. And I will tell you, in my experience at least, that the shooters that are at the very top are tuned in, and they are really, really there to compete. So you may perceive that, if you're not used to being around it, as arrogance or as like some kind of negative character trait, but understand that person is kind of in a different mode at that point. They're kind of in a fight mode. And Laurel, I kind of, sometimes I wonder how it appears to people that, and I think you're a lot like us in some ways, but obviously you're different in others. So, like, what does that look like coming in, and you see guys that are kind of, in that mode? Is that intimidating, or how do you deal with that? How do you want to talk about that? Is that something that even matters?
Honestly, to me, it doesn't really matter that much, because I'm kind of thinking my own stuff and in my own little bubble. It depends if I know who they are. I just know that's them, and they're in their little moment, and they need to figure stuff out. And outside of them shooting, they're giant, big teddy bears that love their dogs. Like it's not the same person. It's like flipping a switch. If I don't know them, then I mean, you can judge them a little bit, but you never know. So you kind of just feel out the ground and see how they act through a couple of stages. If they zero stage and they freak out, or if they zero stage and are just like, all right, let's move to the next one. You just kind of have to feel them out and see what they're gonna act like, and then figure it out based on that.
I got you. Right. All right. So we talked about how we're going to decide what matches we're going to. We talked about how we're going to squad and how some of the people in the squad may act versus others. So if you're really just there to have a good time, I really don't recommend squatting with the top guys. And I only say that because you're probably not going to have as much fun just because they're super serious about it. So if you're there to learn and you really want to move to the next level, absolutely squad with the top guys. And if it's not a huge match, like if it's not an AG Cup match or it's not a qualifier, then it's probably not going to be as big of a deal. But if you're there to really like go and play on the golf course, by all means, squad with your buddies and whoever you want, and you'll probably have more fun. If you're there to learn and get more competitive, jump in the big squad. Jump in with the guys that are known to win matches and be in the top, because you'll definitely learn more. But just know that short, brief period of time, everybody is hyper focused and really trying to perform at the next level. We talked about how to squad. Now let's go into what we're actually going to do to prep for the match. So all of us do this a little bit differently, but we need ammo, and we need our gear, and we need to have a checklist to know how much ammo to have. Like, where do we get that number from, and how do you know what gear to bring? And then let's talk about like tuning the rifle separately. So for right now, let's just talk about like, how do you manage to not forget something and make sure that your ammo and all that's good to go. So Laurel, what are you looking at for that kind of stuff?
So I always look at when you squad or sign up for a match, it has like the estimated total number of rounds. So I always make sure to look at that and then bring like way too much. I always bring a lot extra just in case you have to reshoot a stage or something goes wrong. You just need extra because it sucks to do all that work and get there and not have enough. So I've had that happen. So I always make sure I bring a little bit too much. And then as for the gear part, I use the app Marksman's Journal. It's on the App Store. I built a checklist in it. And so before a match, I just go through that and I check off everything. You got to pay attention to the weather ahead of time. If it's planning to rain, snow, really hot, it all depends. So I kind of pick what of that gear you need to bring. I almost always bring my rain gear because most of the time it says it's not going to rain. It ends up raining a little bit. But yeah, I really just use that app, and I've made a checklist, and I just make sure to go through it every time before I go to match. And I haven't really forgotten much this year, so it seems to work.
Nice. So Keith, you've shot a bunch of matches. I know you do this. You will use your prior experience and know what that match looks like. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you may take your prior experience at a certain venue and apply it to your prep moving forward into that match?
So have you ever forgot any of your gear, Laurel? Seems to me that you might have done that.
Okay, so I talked about the checklist and how it works so well, and the checklist does work really well. You just have to make sure all your bags get into the vehicle you're leaving in. And that happened. We noticed that in North Carolina, headed down to Georgia. I had to stop at Academy. I think it was like a Bass Pro or a Sportsman's, and buy all new clothes, new pants, new jackets, new underwear and socks and rain gear and everything, because it was supposed to be disgusting in Georgia. So that hurt my bank account a little bit, buying all brand new clothes at one time. But yes, so the checklist works great as long as you make sure the bags get into the car and not stay in your room.
So I was on a hunting trip one time. It was like 2.5 hours back to where we were going, and I wanted to be there early. So I left at like 2:33 in the morning to get there. And I've got everything in my truck, and I get down there and I step out, and I'm pretty serious about my hunting, so I don't wear my boots. except for in the woods because I worry about scent and all that stuff. I'm wearing my flip-flops and it's 10 degrees outside. And I get down and I step out of the truck and I go around to get my boots out of the back. And the only thing I have is a pair of flip-flops. And it was like 5 hours back home, 2 hours back to the camp. And so I wasn't able to hunt that day. So having your gear is good. Fortunately, my wife, before I walk out the door every time, she asks 5 key questions, right? And it is, do you have your gun? Yes. Do you have ammo? Yes. Do you have your boots? Yes. Do you have your phone? Right? So you know where to go. Do you have your backpack? And like that is, from that part on, I can get everything at the Walmart, right? Or out of someone else's kit. But she asks that every time, and sometimes twice before I pull out of the driveway. Like as I window down, love you, honey. And she goes through the checklist again, because I have before gone to a match with a 223 that looks identical to my training rifle, that is 100% identical to my match rifle. Did not take the 6BR at the time. And I've also had my bolt sitting on the counter where I had just cleaned it prior to leaving. Those are things that I have on a checklist, my checklist, and then my wife makes sure that I do the other. I need a better checklist. I'll look into that app.
So at last year's finale, I missed like 30 some shots on day one. And then on day two, I ended up borrowing Keith's rifle and only missed 3. At that moment that I was like, you know what, I will not leave for another match without 2 perfect guns. That was one of my like major takeaways for last year coming into this year, was that no matter what, I'm going to prep 2 guns and I'm going to have 2 that are absolutely ready to go, so that if there's ever any question, if there's ever any doubt in my mind that something's not working right, I can just go right to the other gun. I mean, and it's not that there's something wrong. It could just be that the muzzle velocity changed a little bit, or that the load, needed to be tweaked a little bit for that barrel. But man, it has taken a lot of pressure off, a lot of anxiety away, because you don't have to worry as much. You know that you're going to have a good gun. And if that one's not, then you just go grab the other one. And Keith, I know you've done some of that. And Laurel, I know you carry a backup gun as well. So I think a lot of people carry a backup gun, not 100% ready. So I think that's one of the suggestions that I would make, is like prep both guns like you were going to the match with both guns, like you were going to shoot each one as your primary. And when you do that, you're always going to have a good rifle that is 100% ready, because you've got 2 of them. So 2 is 1, 1 is none kind of mentality.
So I've taken that to the next step, and I think you've done a similar thing, Andy. I have 2 identical rifles, which is why I'm a gunsmith, right? With 2 identical chambers. They're cut exactly the same by a really good gunsmith. And what that allows me to do is have 1 batch of ammo. So instead of loading 200 rounds for the match plus 50, I'll generally load like 260 or 270, right? And then I take 2 rifles that are identical, suit the same caliber, same deal. And then I have them both zeroed. They're both good with the same ammo. The ability that I know that I'm able to cut a chamber, I can take that ammo from rifle to rifle and not have to worry about bolt clicks or sizing or whatever. So now I don't have to have 800 rounds of ammo loaded. Now I can take that 370 rounds of ammo or 270 rounds of ammo, check zero, check velocity, both guns, document that, have them ready to go. Pick up the next rifle. Don't need to swap rifle or swap ammo if something's wrong. And then I go right to my backup rifle. That has made my life a lot easier. I used to carry, I got a Dasher and this one runs 32.2, and this one here, I got a BR that runs this. That makes it really difficult to always have that backup, because if they all shoot the same ammo at the end of that match, you could put 10 rounds through each of them and you've ate up the rest of that ammo and you're ready to batch for the next one, right? And a good shooting gun will shoot a good shooting load out of all guns. Like, I mean, there may be a load that is just a slight edge better out of one barrel than another, but realistically it comes down, if you're in the window of where you need to and you're not over pressure and you're shooting good quality barrels with good straight chambers and good quality components, or the fact that I have 2 rifles ready to go, pick up rifle A, shoot it, pickup rifle B, there's 10 foot of velocity difference between the two. And I call my rifles, blue rifle and black rifle. They're in my Kestrel blue and black. That is a practice that I've adopted a couple of years ago, and that has made my life a lot easier. Now, I'll caution you if you're shooting factory rifles or if you're shooting different gunsmiths, cutting different chambers or whatever, that using that ammo rifle to rifle could be a nightmare you don't want to deal with. If you're using a really good gunsmith who specializes in that, that's a zero problem and it makes life really easy.
When we're looking at going to a different venue, let's say that we've been to that venue before. So I kind of break this down, and if I have been to the venue before, then I have data. I know what that looks like. I know what kind of props they use. I know what flavor that match director is. And then if I haven't, then I'm going to talk to some people that have been there and kind of try to figure that out. So Keith, can you kind of talk us through, or Laurel, I'll tell you what, since Keith just finished, let's go to Laurel. Tell me a little bit about how that changes for you. Like if you've been to, let's say, Cool Acres before, how does that change your approach versus if you're going to, say, California to their match where maybe you haven't been to before? What would that look like for your prep?
So if I've never been there before, I kind of practice what I've been practicing. If it's kind of out west, like the Hornady match or the Colorado match that Keith puts on, it's more of a out west territory, so they can't really bring in props. They use more of a landscape things like rocks and trees and items that might already have been there. They pull out and put up there. I practice more of the positional tight space stuff. For a match that I've been to, I kind of try to remember some of the barricades that were there and practice some of the things similar. I don't know that my practice regimen changes majorly depending on what match I go to, but I kind of tweak it a little bit here and there. I'm not huge on the whole rear tripod thing, and it's definitely something I need to work on, but I know a lot of people will definitely probably practice that if that match has more of that. I do recently like the tack table, though. I've gotten more used to that, but I'm still not full on board with the rear tripod yet.
So for me, if I'm going to an event that I know, I'm going to go back and pull that match book, and I'm going to look through that match book and see what the match director did last time, and I'm going to look through my notes that I made in that match book last match. So it might have been a year ago, and I might have been in a different place in my journey as far as I may have gotten better or may have already fixed the problems from last time. But I at least want to go back and look through that and see what that looks like. So, for example, we know Cool Acres uses a lot of tripod rear. We know that they allowed tripod deployment before you get on the clock, so you're able to have your tripod set up. So it's not a very high wind environment, and typically there's not a lot of different targets, different range targets. So a lot of times what I'm practicing is mostly positional, and I'm practicing moving around in between those props. Now, if we're going, let's say, to the Oklahoma match, we know there's going to be a lot of troop lines, and we know there's going to be a lot of near, middle, far, middle, near, or they're going to go near to far, near to far. So I will probably make sure I polish up that transition on my turret so that I can really go through those turret engagements. What I'm getting at here, the takeaway from this should be, don't just overlook the data that you've gotten. So if you've got that experience in a prior, back and pull that data and look through what in the past and what worked well and what didn't, so that you can take that and carry forward. And I think it's really important to your development to go back and see what you did last time versus where you're at now, and see if you can improve some of that stuff. So an example, last time Keith and I decided we were going to use a tripod across the seats in the bus. If you remember that, Keith, went in and just absolutely crushed it, executed it perfectly. And I went in, felt like I was doing okay, but timed out for 2 shots. So this time, this past time when we went to Cool Acres, I knew that was going to be an issue. So when they gave us a practice day, I went into that bus and practiced it both ways, and I realized I was perfectly stable off of just a bag, and I felt like I could go through it, at least get 9 out of 10. And anyway, so I ended up going and doing that and got a much higher score this time. So the point is, if you take that experience experience that you learned the last time and apply it to what's going forward. I think that's just the whole idea of the PRS in general. Like, for example, a guy will go into a stage and he will shoot from different directions of fire, and he'll learn a lot about the wind on that stage, and then he'll completely dump it for the next stage. And it's like, come on, guys, you have to start taking the data that you get on one stage and apply it to the next. So we shot one direction of fire. We learned that was a 4 o'clock wind. Now we're shooting a different direction. What direction does that make the wind now? And it's the same with this prep when we're going into these matches. Like, take the data you learned last time and apply it to your next match that you're going to.
Keeping your match books is key. I mean, I keep them for practice, right? At the end of every stage, this is what I did. Then basically their logbook of that match. I try and organize them by state in my drawer, right? And really my drawer consists of all 50 states stacked that high. I never have put them in folders, but that was the original plan. Like the first year I had Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and then I could go right to that folder and pick all the matchbooks from there. Did not stay filed. So now they're all in a pile in there, and I just start rifling through them all to find the last 3 years matchbooks from that venue, if there is. Taking what you've learned there in the past, the prime example would be either the AG Cup or the finale a year ago at K&M. One of the last stage 16, 17, there was a bunch of diamonds that shoot out over a pond there. And we did it out of the helicopter a couple years ago. And that thing ate my lunch. I got a 3 or 4 on that stage, and I executed every shot perfectly. A 10th right, a 10th left, whatever. And then my last shot, I held like 3/10 high and hit it, right? And I realized I had some sort of issue there. The next time I went to that venue and got to that deal, I basically had that that I was going to figure out how to crush that stage, right? And I watched every shooter and tried to determine whether they were high, whether they were low, because I knew that was a problem for me on that stage. Instead of trusting my data, I went in and I seen everybody was running over the top corners of the plates, right? And I took 2/10 out of my gun on 3 of those targets. I ranged them. I made sure the range was right. The range was right. I mean, I did everything I could to figure out why that was a problem. But then I watched those shooters all shooting over the corners of them. And I'm like, okay, this is just a problem here. I don't know what it is. I can't figure it out. So I want to say the first time through, I wrote my data card both ways. I wrote it with what my data called for and with the 2/10 out, and I put them in 2 individual columns. And so basically I went on, shot it, and then as soon as I missed the first one of those targets that I had missed before, the next target, I went out and dialed that, took that 10th out of the next target or 2/10 out of the next one, and on out for the next 3 targets and then normal data for the last. And then I cleaned the rest of the stage. So I shot 11 out of 12 there or something along that line. But it was as soon as I missed that first target, my history had shown 2 years or 2 times in a row at that venue that stage was a problem for me on those 3 targets, right? And my paperwork said, don't know why, shot high on this. And I looked 2 years in a row that my data said the same thing, right? I tried to solve the problem. And once I realized, as soon as I shot around, seen I missed, rest of my shot a 10th low. But that data I had gathered before in my logs basically told me how to do that. And realistically, that took me, I got an 11 on that stage, and I probably would have got a 6, which was the difference in a good finish at that facility and a bad.
We're going to get into prepping your rifles now. Laurel, in like a minute or less, tell me what's your acceptable accuracy for your rifle, and what do you do to prep your rifle? And we're going to give Keith the same minute, and then we'll go into more detail here in a second. But I just want the brief. What's your acceptable accuracy, and what do you do to get it?
So I usually start with like a clean rifle before I go to a match. Usually it just takes a lot of load development for me. For the finale, 3 or 4 days before I went there, I just did load development all day. over and over and over again to get the best group I possibly could. So I just play with the loads until I can get them really, 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 really close. And then I check it at 100 yards, and then I'll check it at like 300 on paper. And then I usually try to go down to Peg River, and I'll shoot at like 4, 7, 9, and 1,000 or something like that, and make sure it's consistent all the way out. Pretty much all I do is make sure it's clean and work out through any issues and do a lot of load development to make it the best I can get.
So you said you shoot it at 100 yards and another farther distance on paper. What would you say is good and what would you say is bad? So like if you shot a inch group at 500, is that good? If you shot a 5-inch group, is that good? If you shot a 10-inch group, is that good? So like, do you, or maybe you don't even think about it yet, I don't know, but like when you go to 100 yards and you shoot a group and you say, okay, I'm happy with that, what is that number? What does that look like?
Okay, so for 100 yards, I don't even know that it's an exact number. I usually actually take a picture and I call Keith and I said, what do you think? Is this good? Because I just want them all touching. But then he's like, you don't want them in a line and you don't want them in a triangle. You want them in a nice little perfect circle. Because lines and stuff mean things. And if you take 2 grains out, it fixes this. And if you add 2 grains, it fixes that. Keith is like the wizard of load development. So that's usually who I call to. I guess it's not a particular size that I go for. It's the shape, and I want them all touching at 100 yards. And then at 300, I don't usually shoot much past 300 on paper, but at 300 on paper, I would like them in like an inch and a half maybe. I don't want them too big. I don't want it looking like I'm shooting a shotgun. I want to be able to hit a plate. Even if it's a little bit big, I still want to be able to hit a plate. So I don't know that it's an exact number that I look for, but definitely the group shape, and Keith is who I go for to double check that.
Okay, so an inch at 300 would be like third MOA. That's pretty sporty. What are you looking for, Keith?
I'm a little bit of an extremist on this, so it's not necessarily what everyone should do, but it's what I do. I do all my load development at 1,000 yards on paper. Okay, I have an electronic target I have up and I get instant feedback, and that's how I do it. I often won't even shoot my gun at 100 yards till I've developed the load. From that, I've learned a lot about 100-yard groups, that always a one little hole isn't necessarily the best long-range group down there. So what I look for is what the standard for all my guns is at 1,015 yards, because that's where my bench is 5.5 inches by 5.5 inches in a square, not in a circle, but in a square. That's extreme. I'm extreme in my load development, right? It don't take me much to get there with the quality barrels I shoot, the quality components. Pretty easy to accomplish that for me. And that's typically not a 3-shot group, a 4-shot group. That's 5 to 8 shots, 2 days in a row, consistently in that square, right? Now, I don't care where that square hits the paper, right? So typically, I'll go down and I may not even have a good 0 on the gun. I'll have a close 0 on the gun. I shoot it and I see I'm a 10th high, and I do that. I do my load development at 1,000 yards, and I typically have moved from 5-shot groups to 6 and 7, and I look for even density across that square. I mean, if it's windy or something different, I make adjustments for that, right? But in just a normal evening, I go out and shoot for a 5x5 box. And if it's 5.5 one day and 4.5 the other, it averages to be that. I'm good with that. I don't want a bunch of holes and then a flyer high or flyer low, and I never omit a flyer. So we don't make mistakes when we're shooting 100-yard groups, right? We don't make mistakes when we're shooting those long-range groups unless we know it ahead of time. If that bullet doesn't go there, there's probably a reason, right? Maybe the BC of that bullet was off. Maybe the neck tension was off. Maybe you were in between nodes and you were going from a low node to a high node, and that is the kiss of death, right? Because then all of a sudden, if that bullet's 2/10 higher, then a lot of times your barrel moves in triangles, and if you went from this extreme to this extreme, that can change with a few degrees of temperature. So I try and avoid that. I make sure that it's just a nice, evenly populated square. Then I go back and I look at that group at 100. Often that group is a triangle group, and it's a flat triangle group or whatever, and it's typically that's what that comes back to. Now, it may be a half MOA group at 100 that shoots a half MOA at 1,000. And a half MOA group can be pretty big if it's in the middle of a node. Like, I mean, it looks big because it's half MOA center to center, but it looks, they're not all touching sometimes, right? They can shoot in a triangle where they're hitting four corners and you can set a dime in between them and it's still a half MOA-ish, right? But I look at that at 1,000 and I come back and start verifying 0 after that. So proof to be a gun is acceptable to go to a match to me is sub 5.5 inch square for 5 to 7 shots, 2 days in a row or 2 times in a row. I start verifying 0 and I try and verify 0 at least 3 days in a row if I can. That's the ideal. Like I get my 0 hard 0, then I come back the next day and shoot 0. I don't change a thing. And then I shoot the third day 0. I set it the first day. If I see the next 2, it's a 10th high, then I'll probably adjust my 0 on that third day and have notes of that when I show up for the match that, hey, I was a 10th high, but now I'm not. And that's pretty much the basis of what I find to be acceptable. And then I'll generally do one more step. I'll load a 10th or 2 a grain high and a 10th or 2 a grain low. And I shoot at 1,000 yards and I make sure that my elevations, as I change that load, don't go up and down. But I don't go from here all the way up a 10th and a half difference. The problem with those one-hole groups, and it's really great for bench rest, but PRS, it's good enough for the 600-yard stuff, but the far stuff it's not, is what I find is those little teeny tiny one-hole groups are generally at an extreme of barrel timing because it's there the longest and you can pinpoint it and it's most accurate in that deal. But I try and find that average place where it's there all the time-ish instead of that little fine point, because when that changes, then the next time it's one hole, it's down here. And that's why I look for it a couple days in a row. And that's why I go up and down a 1/10 of a grain to make sure that I am just not in that pinpoint little area and that it averages good.
On mine, what I'm looking for is we all do this a little bit differently, and I don't think there's a right or wrong, and I think we could all learn from each other here. I go out and shoot my rifle on paper at 600, and that may be right or wrong, but my thought process behind that has always been that the majority of our targets are 400 to 700. So if my rifle is shooting really, really good at 600, then it's going to be good enough for the long range stuff where the targets are normally bigger anyway. My go, no go criteria for 600-yard groups is 3 inches. So if I can go out 3 days in a row and my rifle will shoot a 3-inch group at 600, I'm going to roll with it and I'm not going to think twice about it. I do go back to that, and most of the time, just like Keith said, a little high and a little low with powder charge, and I will change seating depth by about 5 thousandths in each direction, longer and shorter. And as long as I get that same, half MOA at 600, then it's totally acceptable, and I don't fight it at all. So sometimes that group is 1.5 inches. Sometimes that group is 2 3/4, but I don't care if it's 2 7/8. If it's under 3 inches, I don't stress about it anymore because I have found that that's completely acceptable. Now, I think that what we see a lot of times is optical error. And I think we see some temperature changes and condition changes, and you will also see aerodynamic jump. So one of the things to really keep in mind if you're going to do some of this testing is that if the wind is changing directions, it also changes your elevation. If you're having elevation changes due to wind, it may not be your load or your barrel or your setup. It could just be the environmental changes that are happening. So we just need to make sure that we understand what's going on downrange, and it's not we're not blaming environmental changes on the barrel. I've also kind of gotten to the point of, is with components and everything being so hard to find, if a gun is not shooting good, a lot of times I'll just pull the freaking barrel off. Time for a bad barrel. And I mean, when I say it's not shooting good, if it's shooting a minute, have enough ability to put load development into that gun to fix it. It's right. I'm shooting a known good load and it's shooting a minute. That barrel comes off and I put another barrel on. I may go back and reinvestigate that later, but I just don't if you spend 200 rounds trying to do load development on a barrel, you're basically talking about $200. Well, now you're into a barrel that you could just buy another blank and be back into the business. So I think last year a lot of people got a lot of bad barrels, and I think there was a steel problem out there. And I don't know how everybody managed that, but I know it was really tough on us. And this year I got a lot of really good barrels, and it makes a huge difference. Like, you cannot reload bad barrels away. Like, it doesn't matter how good you reload. If it's a bad barrel, it's a bad barrel.
Yeah, and steel is going to be a problem for the next coming years. There's going to be good batches of steel and bad batches of steel. There's a big window of where acceptable steel is, right? And we've always, for the last 10 years, have been on the good side of that go, no go. With the shortages, the steel manufacturers are running the middle and throwing really anything that fits within that window because the competition isn't high. Like, there's not 27 good steel companies out there producing stuff. They're not having to hold a mark. All they have to do is fit in that window. And that window is more forgiving than we want for barrels or even tooling. Tool and die guys are running through the same problem. Like, they make really, really, really good taps and machine tooling. And all of a sudden now they're having problems not because the steel isn't of good quality. It's of the lower side of the acceptable quality for that steel rating, right? And that's going to be a problem. The bottom line is, if you get a couple good barrels that hold up, you should probably get every damn one you can. Realistically, the way I understand it is they have a massive lot of steel, which may last a year and a half, and that's the ore essentially. But each of those have different heat treat cycles throughout the year. So they'll have batch of heat 1, batch of heat 2, batch of heat 3. So sometimes that bad steel can get okay if the heat happens to be just perfect, right? It's good enough. But we had some problems where, we just had bad steel, and the barrel makers can't tell that. The barrels come out perfect. I mean, everything is exactly the way they're supposed to be.
Shotgun questions real quick. Try to make the answers fast. What cartridge and load, let's maybe not load, but what cartridge and speed are you running, Laurel?
I'm shooting a 6 Creed, and I'm going like 28-50.
She's come to the wise world now.
Took me a while. I'm a little stubborn, but yes, I did.
25-47 for life at 27 and a little bit of change.
Right now I'm running 6.5 Creedmoor at 2680 with a 153.5. So, Laurel, what bullet are you shooting, and why do you think that speed is good?
Depends on the gun. My main gun likes A-tips, loves them. My backup loves nozzlers. They can't mix, but one loves A-tips, the other one loves nozzlers. And I like the lower speed because I can see everything, where when I was running it really fast, I couldn't see near as much. I see like everything now. It's kind of crazy.
So why can you see everything now?
Because it's slowing down.
Okay. I guess what I'm saying is it less recoil, or is it the time?
A little bit of both. I don't know that the recoil is a huge difference, but it's enough. And I can see the time that the bullet takes to leave the barrel and hit the plate is significantly a lot less than it was. So I can see exactly where it's hitting the plate or exactly where it's missing. Where before, when I was running super fast, I was shooting, I was trying to control the recoil, and then bam, it already hit the plate, and I kind of got a guess of where it hit it.
Keith, why do you like what you're running, and why do you think it's better than what you've run in the past?
Slow is it, man. So I've learned over the years that what my eyes see in speed is totally different. So at 2950, I see the plate react, or I might see it hit the plate in certain deals. 2850, I see a lot more of that. And once I get into the 27s, the flight time, the reaction time is a lot better. So a couple things has really changed for me. And this isn't a sales thing, but, MDT come out with that Elite chassis. And that chassis is I mean, it's advanced. The stuff that went into the design of that chassis is pretty incredible. So that allowed me to really shorten my buttstock, change the way I manage recoil, cut down on vibration, and manage a lot more recoil. Okay, and manage that effectively. And I'm not saying that I couldn't manage it well before, but I feel that I can take that to the next level. The fit of that rifle fits me better now. So that allowed me to really experiment with more higher recoiling rounds. And I really changed my whole setup. I changed my scope height. I mean, everything I completely broke down strictly around recoil management. That allowed me to slow my bullet down into the 27s and the low 27s. Allowed me to run a really high BC bullet that still eats the wind, right? I mean, because the velocity is the smallest factor. Time of flight between, and I don't know the numbers exact, but between 2950 and 2750 is like 100ths of a second. I mean, so the actual time that wind's affecting that bullet is like 1% different between the two, right? It's very minimal, whereas the BC is 25-30% higher, and where that is the biggest factor, which is why that happens. So at those slower speeds for me, I'm able to physically watch that bullet fly. I'm able to watch that bullet crush on that plate, like absolutely just watch it. And then because I'm shooting a big bullet with a lot of mass, there's a lot of material dispersing. So I don't see the plate rock right. I watch the bullet explode on that plate. And being able to see that allows me to make literally quarter-inch, half-inch corrections on a plate. Whereas at the other speeds, I would make half a plate corrections or quarter plate corrections. Like I see it hit an inch and a half right to center. I know I can move an inch and a half left to put it on center versus I see it hit the right side of the plate. So I move to the left side of the plate. Like it's a different thing for me. So the big bullet makes a huge difference. It has to be a good quality bullet. Like you can't, bigger isn't better. If the problem with slow is your BC consistency has to be good. You can't have a BC variance from bullet to bullet that allows you to run string high and low at distance over 600-800 yards, right? So you have to have a good quality bullet that'll achieve that. And then a consistent velocity. And then also the other thing about slow, the barrels don't wear out. They don't wear out during the match. You don't get throat erosion. You're not chasing a load all the time. And a low pressure load is generally a consistent load. Like the biggest issue a lot of people have is they're trying to push that cartridge to that edge and they think they can outrun the wind. And when they do that, all of a sudden they see these little flyers, right? They're like 4 little shots in this one little tiny hole in a flyer. Oh, I yanked that. Well, no, really it's generally a sign. When I see those bigger groups or it explode, that's a sign of pressure. And getting them in those really low loads, the barrel's going to be the bigger factor. What you can see is completely different. And the corrections you're able to make based on that. Plus, and when you miss a target, you can see where you missed. You're recovered from the recoil faster. Your eyes have recovered from the shock. Your brain shuts down when an explosion happens. I mean, there is a time that happens. Some people, it shuts down less than others, but I don't care how good you are there. I mean, you're not designed to be punched in the face, right? So when you get punched in the face, you need a second to realize what happened and that shock. And that longer flight time allows that to happen better on short targets and even better on long targets.
Yeah, we all know 6.5 Creedmoor is fanboy cartridge and you shouldn't shoot it. So we'll just leave that one alone. It's not like it won the AG Cup or anything. So it can't be that good. All right. That leads us to, we're getting really close to the end of our prep. So now we're at the match. I typically will go down, check 0 on both guns, and I will check dope on both guns. I will take whichever one I think is shooting better first and make sure it's lined out. And then I will go grab my backup and check that one. With the new Garmin, I check velocity on every shot. I'm looking for what that's doing. I think that piece of gear is really good. So I think that's one of the few pieces of gear that's come out lately that is really kind of changed the game because you can check every single shot with no issue. So do you guys do anything different? Are we looking for, anything more than just a good zero and a good speed and good impacts on target? Because pretty much that's all I'm looking for. How about you, Laurel?
I'd like to make sure I have a good zero. Everything's flying the right way. My SDs aren't crazy. My speed is normal. I guess by the time I've gotten there, I've already checked it like 3 days in advance. So I hope it's not different. But if it is, it gives me a chance to fix something. But other than that, no, I don't check too much other than that. Just make sure everything's flying straight and hitting what I want it to, or hitting where I'm putting it.
For me, when I show up to a match, first thing I do is I check 100-yard zero, both guns. I make sure there's not a lot of mirage. If there's wind, I compensate for it with my Kestrel. I take a wind reading, and put it in, see what it says. Because if it's a 20-mile-an-hour wind, you might be 2/10 high and 2/10 right. Or 3/10 high and 3/10 right. And I dial that into my gun, and then I check my zero, right? I kind of omit my zero in that as, well, I don't know, right? That's not the way to check a zero, and I typically don't make a change in those situations until the next day. I have that wrote down. Oh shit, I need to change this. And after my first couple shots on the first stage, I will make an immediate change if that's the case, but I don't change anything then. But typically I range everything. I range my 100-yard target. If it's 95 yards, that's different. If it's 105, it's probably not if I'm doing a 100-yard zero, right? But I absolutely range every target that I check zero on. And then I look for three ranges. Like I go up there and I look for a middle, a near, middle, and a far. And I try and verify my data with my good gun first. When I say my good gun, the one I feel I'm going to shoot. And I'll try and shoot something in that 400 to 450 yard range. And then I'll try and shoot, and I write down exactly what dope I needed to be waterline at that. If it's 1.8 and 1.9 is too high, I write 1.85. Like if it's in between, I write that down on a piece of paper, right? Actually, I write it on my barrel. But then I go to the next yardage, which I try and find something at 500 to 700 yards. And I range that target, and then I write that down. And then I put the third yardage in, which I like it to be 900 or farther. But what I really need is something that I can get a clear feedback on. If it's not a target, it's a dirt berm or a rock or something that I can get a true what my number is. And I write that down. Then I build a Kestrel profile or a Kestrel target card, my 630 and my 890 in there. And I make sure that as I toggle through those targets, that each of those hit those points within a half a tenth. Like if it's all right there, because there's light, there's wind, there's mirage. And if mirage is there, I omit some stuff too. Mirage screws everything, right? I try and get to the range early, or if it's going to be cloudy. Like those are the two keys that I look for if I have that option. If it's high mirage, I'm shooting off of a bench. I'm shooting up in the air off the ground, right? I want to track my data how it is. So basically, I build that profile. I shoot 3 yardages, make sure it lines up. Then I'll shoot my backup rifle, the same 3 yardages on a target card. And then I make sure how all that lines up. If it doesn't line up, I make those adjustments. Then I will tweak my BC or I'll tweak my velocity. I shoot everything with a chronograph. Now I can do it with the Garmin, and that thing is a great tool. I was a Magneto Speed fan for life, right? I got a little wand, never touched my barrel. Every round of development I shoot across it. Every round of my zero I shoot across it. Now the little Garmin, the thing's cigarette pack size and fits in my backpack and doesn't weigh anything, and it tells me everything really, really well. But that's basically what I do. I do those yardages, and what that tells me is those near yardages tells me that the bullet string with velocity, right? And my scope, and all this tells me my scope is tracking. There's no tracking error. There's nothing weird. And if it doesn't line up, then something's wrong. Maybe I didn't put the latitude in for where we're shooting. Maybe I didn't update my environmentals. Direction of fire was not correct. And dude, if you're shooting 270 degrees versus 90 degrees, there's a difference when you're trying to date out there. That's a 0.2 difference, right? So I try and make sure that all at 1,000 yards. I mean, so I try and figure out what that factor is. First, I try and do my checklist that I've done all that, but I've gone to numerous matches where I've not ran that checklist correctly, and I can't figure out why my stuff wasn't right. And it was because
Pretty much that. So I just wanted to mention this real quick. If you're new to this, there is a function in the Kestrel where you can go to your muzzle velocity down to where it says muzzle velocity truing guide. And even if you're not going to true muzzle velocity, because most of the time we all do BC truing if it's off at distance, and most of the time the velocity is right. And if you're having to change the velocity to get your dope to line up, most of the time it's a tracking error in the scope. But if you're new to this, that muzzle velocity truing guide will walk you through all the steps that you need to do to ensure that you're getting good data. It'll have you set the direction of fire. It'll have you update your environmentals. It'll have you capture the wind. It'll have you ensure your latitude is set correctly. It'll walk you through all of those steps. So if you're not 100% confident that you're going to get every single little piece to make sure your dope's right, it will walk you through that. And then once you go through that, just exit out of it. And by doing that, it'll just ensure that you get it all done. So I think all that's good. We have another piece to that is I usually won't mechanically adjust my zero. I don't know if we mentioned that. I didn't hear anybody say it, but I typically won't mechanically adjust my zero. I will usually do it in the Kestrel where it says 0 height and 0 offset. And if you go to that and hit enter, you can actually go over and scroll over to mils so that you can change that in mils and not in inches. So if you're shooting, at a piece of paper downrange, you can measure it with your reticle instead of having to go downrange to measure with calipers. The other thing that I do is I typically have 2 Kestrels. One reason is to have a backup, but the other reason is so that I don't have to remember to move back and forth between guns in my Kestrel. So I have one Kestrel that is tied to the backup gun and one Kestrel that's tied to the primary gun, so that I don't have to keep up with which gun is which in the Kestrel. They're married to that gun. And that way, if I have to give somebody, let's say I'm going to loan my gun to somebody, I give them the Kestrel, the rifle, and the ammo, and they take everything with them when they go. And it's just a really seamless process there.
One thing about the checking your zero. So I typically make all the corrections on my Kestrel. A few different things. If I shoot and see I'm a little low at center, then I'll make a click up and see how much higher I am and back. Like I'll actually make that click, shoot a couple rounds, then go back and see, make sure, because sometimes when you're looking through a reticle, it's different, right? Than what your perception could be greater than it is, and you can get it back to the correct zero. And then I'll make that correction in there. If it's over a 0.2 change, I'll probably make that correction on my scope, and I'll go over everything and find out why. With these rifles that we have, if you're using good quality components, good quality rings, it's tightening your stock correctly. If you're seeing more than a 2.2 shift, something has caused that. Maybe you smack the scope or the rifle, or that could be the case. That's a point of concern. If you have a big shift like that, we'll make a big shift change in my scope. I'll write down what I did, but all the others I do that offset. And if I'm a 0.5 low, I enter a 0.5 low in my Kestrel. That 0.5 is a big deal when you start with small targets and rounding error. So if you're a 0.5 low, I don't leave that as 0. I'll dial up a 1/10 and I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's the same distance high. So then I absolutely put that 0.5 in there. That 0.5 matters in rounding errors down the road, because then all of a sudden you're shooting a circle at 600 yards. You didn't have that 0.5 low. Data was 3.44. You round 4.0, now you're a 10th low. Now you're shooting a 2-inch wide target instead of the 6-inch wide target everybody else is.
So I think all that's good information. So I want to do a drag racing update. Keith, let's hear your update real quick.
Got the new car picked up last Friday or Saturday. Went in Michigan, brought it home, pulled the motor out yesterday, sold that baby on Facebook Marketplace, got that pulled out. and drove all the way down to Kentucky, picked up a Dokul steel roll cage for it, and a roll bars. Oh yeah, man, you can't believe I got new Willwood brakes for it. And then I stopped at Tin Soldiers Race Cars on the way back and got all the information on what I need to order or pick up for rear end. So now I'm looking for a rear end core that I can mail to them to make me the rear end. So, I mean, I am thinking not about shooting right now. I'm thinking about building a really fast race car. How about you, Andy? How's your race car coming?
So we got the tubular front end, the tubular A-arms, and the coilovers coming for it. I got manual master cylinder coming for it, so I can delete all the ABS and the booster and all that stuff. As of right now, I've got all the parts to do the complete roller. So I'll be able to have the rear end, front end, all the suspension and brakes completely done. And then once that's done, we'll move on to finding an engine to put in it, and it's going to be a twin turbo LS setup. So it'll be a lot of fun, man. I'm so excited about this. I think it's going to be a cool event and a way to day-to-day life. And I think it's all part of the adventure that we all love about going around. So
Laurel, how you coming on the truck?
Respucia is doing wonderful. I have actually, so she's a 2001, but she's fully electric. I have to plug her in to charge in order to get her to start.
So it's not like a Tesla? So you have to plug it in to keep her running?
Yeah, it's kind of a 2-for-1, as my sister says. You got to fill her up with gas, and you have to use electricity to get her to start. But it's all right. Yeah, it's a hybrid that is not a hybrid.
Any upcoming mods you're going to do to Excursion other than maybe a bigger battery pack right now?
So I'm working on something. I'm not going to say all of it yet because I don't have it all done yet, but working on some maybe roof rack and some new tires and make it into a overlanding cross-country truck that I can sleep out of and shoot out of.
With your angry pointy-ear dog that's not angry yet.
I'm excited. Yes, yeah, he's not angry yet. But you guys can find me at Long Range Laurel on pretty much everything, and then you can email me at longrangelaurel@gmail.com.
And pretty easy to find me, Ice Rifles, icerifles.com or Ice Rifles LLC at Gmail, or you can find me on the Instagram at Ice Rifles.
All of my stuff is Rifleman's. So Rifleman's Path is my training company. Rifleman's Outfitter is the store. And then you can get me on email at andy@riflemanspath.com. Guys, we really appreciate you following us, and we would love to have you come back and check us out again. We're going to have some YouTube videos coming up here really soon, and we hope that you'll come back and check that out.